Burke County, Georgia, March 17, 1864. The Civil War is tearing the South apart. But on the edge of the woods, in a sprawling plantation called Thornhill Estate, something darker than war itself is unfolding. Witnesses say a woman ran barefoot into the night that evening, her long dress torn, her hands clutching several leather-bound journals. Her name was Catherine Thornhill, mistress of the estate, a woman feared by her slaves, obeyed by her children, and whispered about by her neighbors. She disappeared into the shadows that night and was never seen again. Her body was never recovered. No grave, no marker, only silence. But what she left behind was far more disturbing. Union soldiers who passed through Thornhill weeks later swore they found a hidden chamber beneath the house. Inside, 23 children, frightened, pale, and silent. None of them knew who their fathers were. All of them, it seemed, were bound to Catherine by something far more sinister than family ties. What secrets were written in those missing journals? Why did Catherine raise her children in isolation, away from the world? And what was the true purpose of Thornhill Estate? This is not the history you'll find in textbooks. It's the story people have tried to bury for over 150 years. A story of power, obsession, slavery, and unspeakable cruelty. Some say Catherine was a monster. Others call her a myth. But the whispers that echo through Burke County tell a chilling tale. That Catherine Thornhill wasn't just a mistress of a plantation. She was the architect of an experiment so dark, even the Confederacy didn't dare speak of it. Tonight, we'll step into the shadowed halls of Thornhill, follow the trail of Catherine's journals, and uncover the twisted legend of the breeder of Burke County. This is the story of Catherine Thornhill, and the nightmare she left behind. Thornhill Estate stood like a shadow over Burke County, Georgia. Isolated miles from the nearest town, it was more fortress than home. The main house, 3 stories tall, was built in stark white timber, its windows darkened with heavy drapes that never seemed to open. Surrounding it were hundreds of acres of cotton and corn, stretching out like a barren sea under the southern sun, unlike other plantations. Thornhill had no laughter, no church hymns drifting from the quarters on Sunday mornings, no gatherings in the fields after work. There was only silence. The kind of silence that makes you wonder what it's hiding. At the center of it all was Catherine Thornhill, widow of a Confederate officer, mistress of more than 100 enslaved men, women, and children. But Catherine's estate was not like others in the South. Where most planters sought profit from cotton and tobacco, Catherine pursued something far more disturbing, something she called continuity. In her mind, the war was temporary. The Confederacy might rise or fall, but Thornhill blood would live on. Catherine believed she was chosen to create a new kind of legacy, one she would craft with her own hands. She kept meticulous notes. Every pregnancy among the enslaved was recorded, every child catalogued. But Catherine did not leave breeding to chance. Rumors whispered that she forced pairings, choosing men and women not for their love, but for their strength, their health, their obedience. And then there were the darker whispers, the ones even her closest neighbors denied to speak aloud, that Catherine had turned her own sons into instruments of her design, that the children born in Thornhill's main house were not only siblings, but offspring of the mistress herself. Was it madness? Was it strategy? Or was it something far more sinister? An attempt to control life itself, to bend family and flesh into something she could claim as entirely her own. Catherine's children lived apart from the enslaved community. While those in the quarters rose at dawn to the sound of whips and work bells, her children awoke in the grand rooms of the Thornhill house. They were dressed in fine clothes, educated by traveling tutors, and fed before anyone else was allowed to eat. But luxury came at a price. Catherine ruled them with an iron will. They were forbidden to leave the estate, forbidden to question her, forbidden even to play with the enslaved children just beyond the fields. Their world was a cage gilded with chandeliers and silver cutlery. From the moment they could speak, they were told that their purpose was greater than ordinary men and women. Catherine drilled into them the belief that they were a new order, chosen by God to continue Thornhill's name when the rest of the South crumbled. Some children obeyed eagerly, others feared her. But all of them, Jonathan, Grace, Thomas, Elelonena, and the rest, lived under Catherine's shadow. A shadow that grew longer, darker with every passing year. Meanwhile, in the slave quarters, whispers spread like wildfire. The enslaved knew Catherine's obsession with her bloodline. They saw the forced pairings, the pregnancies orchestrated like cattle breeding. They knew the rumors of her sons, of what they were forced to do at her command, and as the war dragged on, the burden grew heavier. Cotton shipments slowed. Confederate currency collapsed. Rations thinned. Catherine cut meals to half portions, insisting her children never suffer, even as enslaved families starved. By 1863, hunger gnawed at the estate. Men collapsed in the fields. Mothers gave birth to stillborn children. And yet Catherine demanded more obedience, more children, more control. She claimed the suffering was proof that God was purging the weak and preserving only the strong. But in the quiet hours of night, behind the wooden walls of the quarters, the enslaved whispered, "She is not God. She is the devil." Tension grew on both sides of Thornhill's walls. In the main house, Catherine's children were beginning to notice cracks in her perfection. Why did their lessons never mention their father? Why were they forbidden from speaking to outsiders? Why were the family records written in code, locked away in Catherine's study? And in the quarters, anger simmered like hot coals. Men and women dreamed of escape, of rebellion, of vengeance. A single spark could set the whole estate aflame. That spark would come not from a whip or a gun, but from something far quieter, from the turning of pages. One evening, in the grand halls of Thornhill House, Catherine's daughter Elelonena stumbled into her mother's study. The fire had gone cold, the desk drawers were ajar, and on the polished oak surface lay one of Catherine's journals, its pages filled with strange codes, dates, and names. She opened it. She read, and in that moment, Elelonena realized the truth about Thornhill, about her mother, and about herself. The secrets Catherine had guarded for decades were about to unravel, and nothing inside or outside Thornhill's gates would ever be the same again. The journal lay open on Catherine Thornhill's desk, its ink smudged, its margins filled with tiny notations written in her sharp, deliberate hand. Elelonena had only meant to steal a glance. She had always been warned away from her mother's study, told that the desk contained family business too complex for her young mind to understand. But curiosity, sharpened by years of silence and secrecy, overcame her. And as her eyes traced the first lines of the coded entries, she realized with a slow, sickening dread that this was not simply business. It was obsession. At first, the entries looked like columns of dates and names, meaningless in their arrangement. But the longer she studied, the more sense they began to make. Each entry marked a birth. Each line paired a woman's name with a man's, and beside it, the word issue. She whispered the words aloud, tasting their weight, issue, as if people were not children, but products. Her hand trembled as she turned the page, and then another and another. Years of records unfolded before her eyes. Pregnancies, births, stillborn deaths, all recorded with the detached precision of a scientist keeping track of livestock. And then, buried deeper in the book, she saw her own name. Her lips froze around the letters. Elelonena, issue of Catherine and Jonathan. Jonathan, her own brother. Her knees buckled. She gripped the edge of the desk, staring, breathless, unable to comprehend the full horror. The words blurred, but the meaning was undeniable. She was not her mother's daughter in the ordinary sense. She was her mother's experiment. The sound of footsteps in the hall jolted her. She slammed the book shut, but it was too late. Catherine appeared in the doorway, candlelight flickering across her pale face, her eyes narrowing as they fell on her daughter's shaking hands. There was no need for questions. Catherine saw everything in a glance. The open book, the fear on Elelonena's face, the collapse of innocence. Curiosity, Catherine said, her voice low and cold, is a dangerous sin. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a deliberate click. The silence pressed down like a weight. Elena tried to speak, but her throat burned. All she could manage was a hoarse whisper. "It's true, isn't it?" Catherine moved slowly, her hand brushing the cover of the journal as though it were sacred scripture. "Truth is what I decide it to be," she said. "You were born for a purpose greater than yourself, greater than this war, greater than any nation. My blood runs through you. You are not weak like them." She gestured vaguely toward the windows, toward the slave quarters hidden in the dark. "You are mine, and everything I have done to preserve Thornhill." Elena's tears burned. "You used us. You used him. You used all of us." Her voice cracked. "We're not your children. We're your slaves." For a moment, Catherine's face twisted, not with shame, but with fury. She seized her daughter's chin, digging her nails into the skin. "Watch your tongue," she hissed. "You belong to me as surely as the fields belong to this soil, and you will obey. If you do not, I will sell you to the highest bidder, and you will rot in some backwater cotton field until you wish you had never been born. Is that what you want, Eleanor?" The name stung Eleanor. Catherine only used it when she wanted to remind her daughter that she was nothing more than a possession, a piece of property given a name she did not choose. Elena swallowed her rage, her breath trembling, her heart hammering with the realization that her mother would not hesitate to destroy her. That night, as Catherine slept with the key to her desk pressed beneath her pillow, Elena lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling beams, the truth gnawing at her. Every smile, every gentle word her mother had ever spoken was a mask. Every memory of her siblings laughing in the halls was poisoned. They were not family. They were victims of a woman's ambition, but in her despair, a spark ignited. If the journals told the truth, then she was not alone. Every sibling was bound by the same horror. And beyond them, the enslaved community had seen the same cruelty, had endured the same dehumanization. Catherine's rule was a cage for all of them, gilded or not. And cages, Eleanor thought, could be broken. The next days passed in a haze of secrecy. Eleanor spoke carefully, testing her siblings with small questions, gauging their suspicions. Some brushed her off, too fearful of their mother's wrath. But others, like her brother Jonathan, faltered when she pressed, their silence betraying what they already suspected. At night, she slipped toward the edges of the estate, where enslaved men whispered around dwindling fires. She joined them in quiet, her voice barely above the crackle of the flames, sharing fragments of what she had seen, what she had learned. At first, they recoiled. What good was knowledge if it could not change their fate? But slowly, steadily, her words planted themselves in their hearts. "They are not gods," she whispered. "She is not untouchable. She is not eternal. She can bleed, just like us." The firelight flickered over their faces, faces that had long borne the weight of fear and hunger. And for the first time, their silence broke with nods of agreement, murmurs of resolve. Something dangerous was awakening in Thornhill. Not open defiance, not yet. But the seed had been sown, and in Catherine's own house. It was her daughter who had planted it. And as Eleanor rose from the fireside, her eyes burning with a new clarity, she knew the day would come when those seeds would grow into rebellion. It was no longer a matter of if, it was only a matter of when. The Thornhill estate was quiet in the spring nights of 1864, but beneath that quiet ran a current of dread and defiance. Catherine Thornhill had ruled her plantation with absolute control for years, her voice carrying like a blade through the halls, her gaze enough to freeze even the most rebellious child. Yet in the shadows of the quarters, in whispered conversations after the fields emptied, something was shifting. The journals Eleanor had uncovered had traveled by word of mouth, her coded discoveries spoken softly into the ears of siblings, then murmured again to the enslaved community. A seed had been planted, and it was growing, but rebellion never grows without risk, and the cost of resistance was about to be written in blood. It began with Grace. She was 17, one of Catherine's daughters by blood, but raised under the same iron rules as the others. Grace had always been restless, her spirit sharp and untamed, her eyes lingering too long on the tree line beyond the estate, as though she could see freedom written there. The journals had ignited something in her. She could not endure the truth that Catherine had reduced their lives to an experiment, a grotesque cycle of breeding, punishment, and obedience. One night, as the moon hung heavy over Burke County, Grace made her choice. With nothing but a torn shawl around her shoulders and scraps of cornbread hidden in her skirts, she slipped through the fields, avoiding the lanterns, the dogs, the patrols Catherine had ordered at the edges of the property. She nearly made it, nearly. A hound caught her scent by the creek. Shouts tore across the night. Boots thundered on the ground, and within moments, Grace was dragged back, her face streaked with mud, her hair torn loose, her wrists bound. By dawn, Catherine had made her decision. The children, the house servants, the field hands, all were ordered to gather in the courtyard. The morning air was thick with dread. Catherine stood on the porch, immaculate in her black dress, her hands gloved, her face pale but cold as stone. Grace was tied to the whipping post. "This," Catherine said, her voice carrying in the silence, "is what happens when you betray your mother, when you betray your family. When you betray me." The first crack of the whip split the air like lightning. Grace cried out, her body jerking forward. But Catherine did not flinch. Each lash was deliberate. Each strike meant not only to punish, but to terrify. By the 5th, the crowd had lowered their eyes. By the 10th, children sobbed into their sleeves. By the 15th, blood soaked the earth beneath Grace's feet. Yet Catherine had miscalculated. Where she had hoped to inspire fear, she had instead revealed weakness. Her cruelty was no longer unquestioned power. It was desperation. Those who watched saw not an invincible mistress, but a woman fighting to hold control over a crumbling empire. Her voice cracked when she declared, "This will be the fate of any who defy me." And though the words rang sharp, they trembled beneath their own weight. That night, in the quarters and in the corners of the house, the enslaved whispered. Children whispered. Even the elders, who had seen generations of pain, whispered. Grace's blood had not silenced them. It had awakened them. Secret meetings began in the woods beyond the creek, where moonlight filtered through Spanish moss and frogs croaked in the darkness. Eleanor led them, though she never called herself a leader. She read fragments of Catherine's journals by memory, retelling the twisted logic of a woman who bred children like cattle. She described the generations of lies, the betrayals, the promises of obedience traded for survival. The others listened, some with clenched fists, some with silent tears, and all with growing resolve. They spoke of rebellion, though the word was dangerous. They spoke of running, though the world beyond the plantation was filled with Confederate patrols and uncertain futures. They spoke of Catherine's downfall, not if, but when. Each meeting carried risk. Catherine's suspicion was growing. She prowled the halls at night, lantern in hand, her ears straining for whispers. She demanded loyalty oaths from the children, demanding they kneel before her and swear obedience. She kept the keys to the cellar on her belt at all times, and she began locking food stores more tightly. Rations shrank. Hunger gnawed. But hunger only sharpened the edge of rebellion. By May of 1864, the air itself seemed heavy with tension. Soldiers passed through Burke County more frequently, their uniforms ragged, their eyes hollow. The Confederacy was collapsing, though Catherine refused to acknowledge it. She insisted Thornhill Estate would survive, that their family bloodline was chosen for something greater than the war, greater than history itself. But in the woods, hope grew louder. Plans sharpened. Some spoke of stealing weapons from the soldiers who camped on the edge of town, others of setting fire to the barn as a signal. A few, braver than most, whispered of killing Catherine outright. Eleanor listened, but never chose a path aloud. She knew Catherine was listening too, always listening, and she was. Catherine Thornhill's instincts had kept her in control for decades, and she could feel the storm pressing in. The journals she had hidden were gone, and though she did not know who had taken them, she knew their words were spreading. The eyes of her children lingered on her too long, filled with questions they did not dare ask. The enslaved no longer bowed as deeply. Even the house itself seemed restless, the shutters rattling in the night, the floors creaking under invisible weight. Catherine began to prepare her final plan. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance and the first hints of summer storms split the sky, she gathered the children into the great hall. The fire burned high in the hearth, throwing shadows across the walls. Her voice, low and deliberate, carried over the crackling flames. "The world outside is falling," she said. "The Union will come. They will tear apart everything we have built here. But we will survive. Our blood is stronger than their laws, stronger than their guns, stronger than their God. You are mine, and you will remain mine. No soldier, no war, no rebellion will take you from me." She paced the room, her eyes shining feverishly. "When the time comes, you will follow me into the cellar. We will seal ourselves away from the chaos above. Food, water, all prepared. And when the war is over, when the world has forgotten itself, we will emerge. We will continue. We will endure. Because you are not just my children, you are my creation, my legacy." The children sat frozen, some with tears in their eyes, some with rage in their hearts. Eleanor's hands trembled in her lap. Grace's scars had not yet healed, and her body bore the memory of Catherine's cruelty. But her eyes, oh, her eyes, burned with defiance. She met Eleanor's gaze across the fire, and in that unspoken glance, the plan was sealed. The rebellion would not wait. The storm was coming, and so was the reckoning. The storm broke over Burke County in late March of 1864. The rain came in sheets, drumming against the roof of Thornhill Estate. While the wind howled like the voices of the dead, the house groaned under the weight of the storm, shutters banging, trees bending, thunder shaking the walls. Inside, Catherine Thornhill prepared her final act. She had grown restless in those last weeks, her eyes wild, her words sharp and feverish. The rebellion she sensed but could not see gnawed at her from every corner of the house. The whispers, the stares, the faint defiance rising in her children. She had punished, threatened, locked doors and reduced rations, but control was slipping like water through her hands. So Catherine chose the only path she believed would preserve her creation. On the night of March 17th, she summoned her children into what she called the Heritage Room. It was a chamber rarely opened, its walls lined with portraits of Thornhill ancestors, stern men in powdered wigs, pale women with tight smiles. In the center of the room sat a long oak table, polished to a dull shine, its surface crowded with decanters of wine, pewter goblets, and a single glass vial filled with amber liquid. The children came reluctantly. Jonathan, the eldest son, his shoulders broad but his eyes dark with doubt. Eleanor, her face pale with knowledge of the journals. Grace scarred and trembling but unbroken. And the others, silent, moving like shadows under Catherine's command. She welcomed them with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "My beloved ones," she began, her voice rich, echoing against the high ceiling. "The world outside has descended into chaos. Soldiers march, towns burn, and all that is sacred is being torn away. But here in Thornhill we remain pure. We remain unbroken. And tonight we bind ourselves together forever." She moved to the table, her gloved hands steady as she poured wine into each goblet. The children watched in silence, some exchanging nervous glances. Catherine lifted the glass vial and uncorked it with a soft pop. A bitter-sweet smell drifted into the air. Opium tincture, laudanum, her old companion. She poured a few drops into each goblet, her movements deliberate, ritualistic. "This," she whispered, "will ensure our unity. When the storm passes, when the war ends, we will awaken renewed. No one will take you from me. Not the Union, not the slaves, not God himself. You are mine, and you will remain mine." The children sat frozen. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he stared at his cup. Eleanor's hands shook under the table. Grace let out a faint sob, quickly silenced. Catherine raised her goblet and smiled at them with eerie calm. "Drink, my darlings. Drink, and we will never be parted." But Jonathan did not lift his glass. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed it away. "No," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "We are not yours anymore." Catherine's smile faltered. What did you say? Eleanor rose to her feet, her voice shaking but loud enough to carry. We know the truth, Mother. The journals, the lies, what you've done to us. We are not your creation. We are your prisoners. The room seemed to contract, the storm outside crashing like an answer. Catherine's eyes darted between them, disbelief curdling into rage. Ungrateful wretches, she hissed. I gave you life. I gave you purpose. Without me, you are nothing. Jonathan moved closer to Eleanor, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Without you, we are free. The other children stirred, some lowering their goblets, some rising shakily from their chairs. The spell Catherine had held for so long was fracturing before her eyes. Her lips curled back, and with a sudden shriek she swept the decanters from the table, wine spilling like blood across the wood. You will obey me, she screamed, but her voice cracked, no longer the unshakable command of the mistress of Thornhill, but the desperate cry of a woman cornered. Then came the turning point. Grace, trembling and broken from her punishment, stepped forward. Her voice was hoarse, but it carried the weight of every lash, every scar, every stolen choice. You are not our mother. You are a monster. The room erupted. Children shouted, some reaching for Catherine, others backing away in fear. In the chaos, Jonathan lunged to restrain her, but Catherine twisted free with a surprising strength, her nails raking his arm. She bolted toward the cabinet at the far wall and yanked open its doors. Inside were her journals, stacks of leather-bound volumes filled with coded writing, and jars of preserved specimens, bones, organs, things better left unnamed. She gathered as many as she could into her arms, her skirts swirling as she fled the room. "Stop her!" Eleanor cried. But Catherine was already gone, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The children followed, their shouts drowned by the storm. They chased her through the corridors, past the shuttered windows and the rattling doors, until she burst out into the rain-soaked night. Lightning lit her figure as she stumbled barefoot across the mud, clutching the journals to her chest like holy scripture. No one ever saw Catherine Thornhill again. Some say she vanished into the woods, consumed by the storm. Others believe she made it to the river, her body carried away by the current. But the whispers that lingered in Burke County told another story. That night, as the children huddled together in the house, the enslaved of Thornhill Estate moved silently through the rain. Some carried torches. Others carried blades. They had seen Grace's blood. They had heard Eleanor's truth. And they had waited long enough. The journals were never recovered. The specimens vanished. Catherine herself was never buried. But in the fields, in the woods, in the hushed voices of those who remembered, it was said that justice was carried out not by God, not by war, but by the very people she had enslaved. Her body, they whispered, was hidden where no one would ever find it, her name cursed, her memory rotting with the soil. By morning, the storm had passed. Thornhill Estate stood quiet, its mistress gone, its children staring into a future they could not yet imagine. The rebellion had not erupted in fire and blood. It had ended with a disappearance, a silence that spoke louder than violence. And so Catherine Thornhill, the so-called breeder of Burke County, became a ghost, not a legend of glory but a shadow, whispered of in fear, in warning, in half-remembered tales told long after the war was over. Her final plan had failed. Her family had broken free. Her name was buried in secrecy. But her story, her horror, lived on. When the Union soldiers reached Burke County in the late spring of 1864, Thornhill Estate was already a husk of itself. The fields were overgrown, the quarters half empty, the great house stripped of its mistress's authority. The soldiers found no trace of Catherine, but what they did find would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath the floorboards of the cellar, locked behind iron doors, were 23 children, malnourished, pale, their eyes wide with terror. Some were Catherine's direct offspring, others the tangled product of her program. None could say who their fathers were. Many barely spoke at all. The soldiers recorded their discovery in brief clinical notes, details that disappeared into war reports, overshadowed by the collapse of the Confederacy. But those who carried the memory never forgot the sight. A brood of children raised in silence and fear, pulled from the shadows of their mother's obsession. What followed was chaos. The Union Army seized Thornhill Estate, confiscating the land and dispersing its stores. Freedmen who had once labored in its fields took what they could, some staying on the soil that had enslaved them, others moving north in search of a life not haunted by Catherine's shadow. The legal battle over Thornhill was long and bitter. Distant relatives in Savannah and Augusta tried to claim the estate, but questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and wartime confiscation tangled the case until Thornhill simply rotted. By 1870, the house was abandoned, its windows broken, its roof sagging. As for the children, their fates blurred into mystery. A few were placed in northern orphanages. Some were taken in by distant family members, hidden away as wards rather than acknowledged as blood. Others slipped into obscurity, vanishing from records altogether. In Burke County, whispers followed them, whispers of the Thornhill bloodline, cursed by incest, haunted by madness. No one wanted to claim them. No one wanted to remember. Then in 1871, a rumor spread like wildfire. Hunters in the woods claimed to have found a skeleton tangled in roots near the riverbank. The remains of a woman, dressed in what little cloth the earth had not devoured. No one could prove it was Catherine. Some insisted it was another lost soul, some runaway who perished in the swamp. But others swore the teeth matched the infamous mistress of Thornhill, that her journals and bones had been scattered by the elements, that the earth itself had tried to swallow her shame. The black community of Burke County carried the memory more vividly. Freedmen told their children and grandchildren stories of the devil mistress of Thornhill. In their versions, Catherine was not merely cruel, she was a witch, a demon in human form who sought to twist bloodlines and souls alike. Parents would hush their children at night with warnings, "Don't stray near the old house, or the devil mistress will take you too." The oral traditions turned her into a spectre, part cautionary tale, part whispered justice. For decades, the ruins of Thornhill Estate stood as a reminder of what had happened. Vines crept over the porch, owls nested in the rafters, and travelers avoided the road that led past it. Some claimed they heard crying from the cellar when the wind was strong. Others swore they saw a woman in black drifting through the trees, clutching books to her chest. Historians rarely touched the story. The Civil War had produced enough blood and horror without adding tales of incest and madness. Catherine Thornhill's name never appeared in official histories of Burke County, nor in genealogies of its wealthy families. But in hushed voices, in kitchens, in churchyards, and around fire pits, the legend endured. The children of Thornhill grew into adults, scattered across the South and beyond. Some changed their names, seeking to bury their past. Some carried the scars in silence. A few told fragments of their story, only to be met with disbelief. And so the truth of Catherine Thornhill lived on, not in books, not in archives, but in shadows, half fact, half legend, always too dark for the daylight. By the end of the 19th century, Thornhill was gone. Its timbers sold for scrap, its stones pulled for other buildings. Only the land remained, heavy with silence, as if it remembered. Farmers ploughed the fields, children played in the woods, but those who knew the old stories never lingered long after dark. And so Catherine's legacy was twofold, in the scattered bloodlines of her children, some who vanished, some who survived, and in the whispers that never stopped, whispers of the devil mistress, whispers of the journals that no one ever found, whispers of justice delivered not by courts or war, but by those she had sought to control. For the people of Burke County, Catherine Thornhill was not history. She was a haunting. The ruins of Thornhill may be gone, its timbers and stones scattered, its fields turned under by new hands, but the story refuses to die. Every generation in Burke County has carried a version of it forward, reshaping Catherine Thornhill into whatever the times demanded. To some, she was a wicked mistress. To others, a demon in disguise. To still others, nothing more than a whispered warning about the dangers of unchecked power. But the question lingers, Was Catherine Thornhill real? The official record is silent. No court papers, no gravestone, no census line neatly marks her existence. Historians often dismiss her tale as folklore, a southern Gothic legend invented to explain away the horror of slave breeding that truly did happen on plantations across the South. And yet silence does not always mean absence. Some swear she lived, that soldiers saw her children, that journals once existed, passed hand to hand before vanishing again into the earth. If Catherine was real, then perhaps she was one woman embodying the system's darkest instincts, the cold calculation of slavery, the reduction of people into breeding stock, the obsession with bloodlines and control. If she was not, then perhaps her legend grew from countless unnamed women and men who suffered under the same brutal logic, whose stories were too scattered to survive except in whispers. Either way, Thornhill stands for something larger than one name. It reminds us that slavery was not just brutal, it was systematic. It was calculated. It was designed to erase humanity and replace it with obedience. Catherine Thornhill, real or not, becomes a symbol of that truth, and yet, despite it all, the enslaved resisted. They whispered the truth in secret. They stole back their humanity in small, everyday acts. They preserved memories in song, in prayer, in stories told long after the plantations fell. And in the end, Catherine's name was buried while theirs lived on. Think about that. The woman who sought to control every birth, every breath, every choice, gone. No grave, no legacy, only a curse whispered in the dark. But the people she sought to erase? They endured. Their descendants live in Georgia today, their bloodlines stretching across America, carrying forward resilience, memory, and survival. So what do we do with a story like this? Do we treat it as horror, as legend, as entertainment? Or do we see it as a mirror? A reminder that the past is not gone, that the cruelty once carried out in places like Thornhill still ripples outward, shaping lives, shaping systems, shaping the present. The soil of Burke County is heavy with history. Beneath its fields lie bones unmarked, stories untold, secrets never written. Some say Catherine Thornhill's journals still lie buried there, waiting to be unearthed. Some say her ghost wanders, clutching her children to her chest, searching for the control she lost. Others believe justice was already served, that her body was hidden deep in the woods, consumed by the very earth she once claimed to rule. What do you believe? Was Catherine Thornhill real? Was she a woman of flesh and blood, or a legend woven from fear? Was everything revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the soil of Burke County? Let me know in the comments below. And remember this, the past is never as far behind us as we'd like to believe. The echoes of Thornhill remain, in the silence of the woods, in the stories passed from generation to generation, and in the lessons we must carry forward. Because history is not just what we record, it is also what we bury. And sometimes, what we bury refuses to stay hidden. You are about to hear a story that destroyed a plantation, erased 13 men from polite society, and left a ledger scorched into ash. But not before the ledger had already taken lives. In April 1841, a wealthy plantation owner in South Carolina handed his adult daughter over, not to a doctor, not to a husband, but to one of his enslaved men. He called it medicine. The county called it a scandal. What happened inside that house over the next 6 weeks defied everything the people who worship power believed. This is the night the privileged burned themselves, and the story the official records tried very hard to forget. Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. If you love dark historical mysteries, the ones where truth hides in the corners of the past, you're in the right place. Today's episode follows 3 people: a man who valued reputation more than blood, a woman the county labeled mad, and a man whose family was torn apart and sold like timber. Their lives collided around a ledger, a book that recorded not just names and dates, but ritual and appetite. When that ledger was found, it threatened to rip the county's polite fabric apart. So they called it a scandal. They called it an accident. They wrote eulogies. They lit candles. But some bones don't lie. And when the people with nothing left to lose learned what those bones proved, they decided to answer in a language their owners had always known. Violence gathered and returned. This is not a neat courtroom drama with transcripts and judges. This is a story of slow preparations, of poison disguised as care, of bargains forged in secret societies, and of one violent ordered night that changed a county forever. Stay with me. I'll take you back room by room to Cypress Grove. And yes, there's a ledger. We'll show how it was found, what it said, and why burning it mattered more than letting it stand. Picture early spring in the low country of South Carolina. The air so thick it seems to hold itself up. Spanish moss draping live oaks like mourning cloth. Rice fields that look like mirrors, but they're mirrors with boots in them. The Combe River moves slow and patient, swallowing sounds and secrets. This is not romantic wilderness. It is cultivated wealth, built inch by inch on other people's bodies. Cypress Grove sits on 800 acres, not the grandest plantation in the county, but large enough to be a name and to require servants, overseers, and men willing to look the other way at cruelty. Its owner, Silas Rutledge, wanted more than land. He wanted standing. He wanted the access that came when your name could close doors or open them. He'd acquired a kind of reputation for shrewd deals and cold discipline. Men like Silas understood that power is a performance as much as a possession. If you can persuade people you are untouchable, they rarely bother to test you. His daughter, Catherine, is where the performance and the private rot met. A pretty child once, kept behind curtains of tutors and diagnosis. By 28, she was heavy, more than 260 pounds, and wrapped in prescriptions that doctors presented as kindness. In that era, female nervous disorders were a catch-all diagnosis. Hysteria was a word that justified anything. But in truth, Catherine carried memories no one wished her to keep. She had been 12 when she first saw what the men of Colleton County held in their basements. She saw a ritual no child should see. From that day onward, her life was measured in pills, in isolation, in whispers that she had gone insane. And then there were the Brethren, a secret circle that called itself something like the Harvest and kept a signet no one on the outside would understand. They mixed old European secrecy with borrowed rituals from people who had long memories of the spirit world. They believed, in the most literal and sickening way, that certain sacrifices fed the land and their fortunes. Membership gave favors, judges who looked the other way, loans quietly forgiven, debts paused, reputations polished. For men like Silas, the Brethren were insurance. For others, they were predators in robes. So in the soft, slow heat of April 1841, beneath an economy of rice and cotton, a bargain was sent on thick paper and red wax. It arrived at Rutledge's study at night, and it carried a demand that would make the civilized gasp, that the owner place his daughter under the complete authority of an enslaved man for a full year as proof of loyalty. The county would get the show it wanted, a wealthy man humiliated for the sake of a club's favor. What they did not anticipate was the collateral they had created. Let's meet them properly. Silas Rutledge, tall, thin, hair gone gray, like a man who'd given more care to legacies than to love. He sold people like furniture when it suited him, and once did it just to prove a point. He believed in hierarchy, in the rightness of the strong over the weak, and he surrounded himself with men who would affirm that worldview in private. Silas was not flamboyantly cruel. He preferred the small, efficient kinds of brutality that could be missed by polite observers. Catherine Rutledge, raised to be ornamental, then dismissed as broken. She was medicated into submission, told the trembling and screaming were her own fault. But memory is stubborn. Under the medicated haze, there was a mind that recorded names, dates, footnotes of ritual, tiny details most people mistakenly think children forget. When some of that clarity returned, Catherine became dangerous, not for what society wanted her to be, but for what she could tell. Ezekiel Cross. purchased and moved south specifically into this household. He was quiet, large, with hands used to skilled work, a carpenter, a healer in the way the old folk called it. Ezekiel was not a caricature of rage at first. He was patient. He had been broken by living memory, sold away from a wife named Sarah and children named Benjamin and Ruth, all of whom died soon after their sale. When he learned the buyer was connected to men like Silas, he began to plan. Patience breeds cunning. He edged towards Cypress Grove on purpose, knowing that getting close to the problem sometimes means living inside it. And the brethren, 13 men who behaved as if their robes made them accountable to nothing but their oaths. Judges, ministers, men of influence who met in ritual rooms. Their ledger listed sacrifices, not probate. It listed appetites, as if they were inventory. When your membership is built on mutual complicity, that ledger becomes the spine of your power. Now, put these people in the same house. Give the owner a pile of debt and a letter that can erase it if he publicly demonstrates loyalty to the brethren. Give the daughter a ledger of her own memories and a will that would not survive another suppression. Give the enslaved man a slow-burning hunger for justice and a talent at herbal cures that would let him play the doctor. Mix them carefully and wait. Every character here makes choices that matter. Silas chooses reputation over a daughter's dignity. Catherine chooses lucidity and revenge over comfortable silence. Ezekiel chooses infiltration over immediate bloodshed. The brethren see themselves as arbiters of order. None can imagine the scale of what they've set into motion. On April 7th, the letter arrived, red wax, a symbol he recognized, a scythe crossed with wheat. Silas read it alone by candlelight. The sum was enormous. The choice was ugly. Sell land and people, or perform a public humiliation that would prove his loyalty. He signed the acceptance. 3 days later, Ezekiel arrived, delivered in a trader's wagon straight to the house. That arrival's scene is important. Silas does not even look at the man's hands on the papers. He only nods. Ezekiel looks back, not with fear, but with something steady and calm that unsettled the master. He had been chosen, it seemed, for reasons that were not accidental. Catherine sat like a caged animal and watched from the second-floor window when the announcement was made. Silas invited the county's elite to a dinner. After oysters and roasted duck and a towering cake, he rose and told them what he intended. His daughter would be placed under the full authority of an enslaved man named Ezekiel Cross. He framed it as medical progress. He framed the humiliation as necessary. The room shifted, curiosity, gossip, a little disgust. To say this night was scandalous is an understatement. Yet none of the men tried to stop him in a public, legally binding way. Their whispers were the thinnest kind of complicity. The point of that transfer is twofold. First, it exposed Catherine to a different kind of care. Second, it allowed Ezekiel the kind of access most enslaved men were never given. He could go where other hands could not. He could see the study, the cellar, the locked drawers. That access would become crucial. But the transfer was also performance for the brethren. It showed that even a man who feared ruin would sacrifice his own daughter for the sake of a pact. That willingness to sacrifice family for group loyalty is the heartbeat of the brethren's power system. It buys them silence, it buys them protection, and it guarantees that nobody outside the club can use moral outrage to undo them. Ezekiel's first days with Catherine looked like caregiving, tapering the drugs, applying herbal tinctures, forcing short walks, feeding different food. But beneath the herbalism was an operation. He was rebuilding a mind that had been deliberately numbed. He was detoxing a woman from the very substances that had been used to hide truth. It was brutal. Catherine vomited, shook, and raged as the opiates left her system. For 3 days, she was worse before she was better. Ezekiel sat at her bedside. Each time she regained a sliver of clarity, they spoke. He told her how Silas had bought his family and ripped them apart. She told him what she had seen at 12. They were allies bound by different but compatible angers. Catherine had been writing for years, a private journal coded into nonsense lines so no one would understand if they happened upon it. She had a memory of a hidden room beyond the cellar. It was small, just big enough for secrecy. She had heard the men speak of a ledger that recorded rituals over decades. If that ledger existed, it would be proof, not testimony. Proof is dangerous. It makes rumor into indictment. They timed their break-in for the period Silas would be away in Charleston. The plan was meticulous. They waited for night, for the house to settle into a careless sleep. Ezekiel learned the kitchen layout. He discovered the false panel behind the pantry. They slipped down the stairs and met the smell of old rot, the smell of cellars that hold things men wish to forget. Finding the inner chamber was like finding the bone of the operation. The ledger sat on a stand like a heart. Heavy leather, metal clasps, pages of parchment with dates and names going back decades. The entries were clinical, horrifying, ritual dates, participants, a ledger not of grain or cattle, but of people. Notes on preparation for consumption and scheduling, items that read like invoices. Men who were judges and ministers had their names written like suppliers. Ezekiel found his family's entry in October 1838, 3 lines. Purchased family unit separated, sent to Alabama. Payment received. No regret, no apology. That was it. A transaction recorded like a bag of seed. He felt cold rage move through him, the way heat moves through a bell. For Ezekiel, proof was personal. For Catherine, it was the unlocking of a long-locked memory. They started copying entries. If they took the ledger itself, the men would know immediately. But copies could be hidden, protected, distributed. They wrote in the candlelight, hands shaking. Catherine translated her coded notes, names she remembered, dates of meetings, who sat where. Ezekiel cross-referenced what he could from memory. It took hours. This was no crime of passion. This was research for justice, and then they were caught. Footsteps above, light flooding the outer chamber. Silas standing in the doorway as calm as if he had been expecting them to applaud. He had not gone to Charleston after all. He had come home and he had watched. He had anticipated an attempt. He considered them, then smiled the way men who believe themselves safe smile, a small measured curl of the mouth that says, "I hold all the cards." He arrested them not with immediate violence, but with optics. He brought them upstairs, locked them in the study, the windowless room with the high transom. He called the brethren. The performance continued. This was a trial theatre, and the audience was domestic, elegant disaster. The brethren arrived in robes, candles, the sort of ceremonial gear that turns men into actors. They assessed the situation like a business meeting. Some wanted immediate death. The judge said, "Silence them." Standard, efficient, bureaucratic murder. Silas stopped them. He said he had an experiment, a test. Could a man who has been wronged be brought into their network of complicity? Could hatred be converted into complicity? It was arrogance disguised as strategy. Silas proposed a bargain, Ezekiel's life in exchange for membership, not full equality, but the privileges of association. They would give him access to resources to destroy other men who had harmed him. They would permit him to become the instrument and beneficiary of a network that ate people figuratively while sometimes consuming them literally. He offered Catherine exile to the north, a new identity, a stipend, and a promise she would not be returned. They would claim she was dead to the county. Ezekiel would be watched, tested, and then folded in as an associate. For a moment, the options were threefold: refuse and die, accept and compromise, or play for a third path. Catherine pleaded with Ezekiel not to let them change him. She said the bargain cost more than revenge. Ezekiel saw the logic of both sides. Inside, you can gain power and protect others. Outside, you may be hunted and killed with terrible efficiency. The bargain was almost credible because the brethren had resources enough to make it credible. They made the deal. Catherine was promised exile. Ezekiel would be initiated in 3 weeks. Until then, he would be watched. He accepted outwardly. Inside, his mind began to plan. The initiation, according to Silas, would require participation that would prove his loyalty. That night, Silas visited him and told him plainly, Do not hesitate at the test. Hesitation means death for both you and Catherine. It was a threat dressed as counsel. Ezekiel slept badly. He read the torn pages of the ledger he had secreted. The ledger itself was a kind of evidence of the brethren's immunity, but the entries about other men, other properties, names of victims, and hidden rituals were power in paper. He also found, in the margins of some pages, notations that suggested the brethren were not invulnerable. They had rivals, they had places that held grudges. Ezekiel tasted a plan in that ink. What if he could become the instrument of the brethren's fall by capturing them not through law, which would fail, but through a blow that left no trace? He began to map the cellar, the guards, the times. He started to prepare the third option, a direct, violent break. Midnight came for the initiation. Ezekiel was brought down, stripped to the waist, bound, and made to stand before the circle. They brought forward a young enslaved woman as the test. She was terrified, her life cheap. They wanted Ezekiel to make the cut. The century's cruelties are often very specific in how they test people. This was the point where a man either took the life of another to prove himself, or refused and died. Ezekiel reached for the knife, and, in a motion no one anticipated, he drove it into the throat of the nearest man. The blade flashed. Blood sprayed. He turned the test into an assault. He grabbed robes, plunged the room into chaos by pulling a robe into the candles. The brethren had power in society, but they were not muscle. They were men who signed documents and hired labor. Ezekiel fought like a man who had learned rage through loss. He cut the altar bonds, freed the woman, shouted, "Run!" and ran. Above, Catherine had not gone north. She had been somewhere else entirely, hiding in the slave quarters, recruiting. She told people the ledger existed. She showed them scraps. She convinced 23 people, men and women, who had endured brutality and been told their lives did not matter, to come armed with axes, field tools, things that could topple a rotted order. When the freed woman burst back into the slave quarters and Catherine led the force into the cellar, it became not a duel, but an avalanche. The enslaved people poured down like a tide. There was no mercy. Not because revenge was sweet, but because justice had been stolen for so long that this was the only language available. Judge Pelham tried to fire a pistol, and the story says he didn't get to. Men were struck down. Reverend Crenshaw begged for mercy. There was none left to give. Silas, desperate, grabbed his daughter and threatened her life. For a split moment it seemed all could be lost. But Catherine had become something else, hardened, precise. She struck him. He fell. Ezekiel stood above him and spoke quietly. "You took everything. There will be no mercy." And then the slaughter ended. 13 men, members of the brethren, died that night in the cellar. After the bodies, the ledger had to be dealt with. The enslaved people who had helped planned, burn it. Why? Because a ledger proved a crime. But a ledger could also become the spear that brought 1,000 men down. If the brethren's network saw a ledger in someone else's hands, they would hunt until every link was severed. So they burned the ledger. The women and men who had come to help dispersed before dawn. They would say nothing. They had their reasons. Catherine tore out the lines about Ezekiel's family. Ezekiel folded them into his shirt to keep Sarah, Benjamin, and Ruth named. Then they set the cellar alight. They staged it to look like an accident. Candles, overturned kindling, a fire that would be blamed on waning responsibility. The house burned, the beams fell, and by morning the official story existed. A tragic fire, 13 men lost, the owner and his daughter dead. The county mourned, funerals were held. No one looked beneath the smoke. The official record, an accident. Eulogies praising community men who had given their lives. Catherine reported dead too. The enslaved people scattered, some sold, some sent away, carrying the secret in their heads and their silence. That silence is crucial. The law belonged to those with power. The truth belonged to those who survived. Years later, snippets surfaced, bones in swamps discovered by Union troops in 1863 during the war. An old journal found in 1971, sealed in a wall and then mysteriously missing. Some say the journal was destroyed by descendants who wanted to protect reputations. Others say it was hidden by someone who thought the time to reveal it had not yet come. What matters is this: there was a ledger, there was a fire, and something happened that night that made the polite narratives falter. Stories traveled in the quarters and in whispers across plantations. Some became legend, some became fuel for escape networks. The small acts of subversion turned into a rumor that helped people survive. So what do we take from this? First, power can make men monstrous and communities blind. When institutions prioritize reputation over life, ugly bargains are made in candlelight. Second, people with nothing to lose often become the instruments of change, not always cleanly, not always morally, but with a logic all their own. And finally, memory matters. Catherine's notebooks, Ezekiel's folded pages, the whispers in the quarters. These are the strands that keep truth alive when the courts and the ledgers are silent. Was it justice? To some, the answer will be yes, a necessary eruption. To others, the violence will be a problem. Violence births violence. But this story is not meant to comfort. It is meant to ask a question. When systems are designed to be unaccountable, who becomes judge? Who takes the ledger and reads it aloud? Before we close, and before we burn this chapter like the others tried to burn it, I'll say it plainly: these stories need ears. They need to be told. They need to unsettle the comfortable. If you believe in preserving the voices that systems tried to erase, share this story. Share it with someone who thinks history is tidy. It is not. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who loves mysteries that blur the line between history and horror. These stories need to be remembered. These voices need to be heard. I'd love to know, do you think that journal still exists somewhere waiting to be found? Comment below. Tell me your state and what story about hidden histories you want next. Somber music fills the air as the flicker of candlelight dances across a long dining table covered in polished silverware. The room is still, too still, as a voice breaks through the quiet. The children would sleep peacefully while the adults paid for their families' sins. Those were the last words ever written in a small, leather-bound notebook found buried in the ashes of the riverside plantation. January 27, 1849. What was meant to be a night of laughter, music, and matrimony became one of the most haunting acts of vengeance in Mississippi's history. By dawn, 17 guests lay dead, men and women from some of the South's most powerful slave-holding families. There were no signs of a struggle, no screams, no gunfire, only silence, and the faint smell of roasted lamb and sweet wine. The killer wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a rebel or a thief. She was the plantation's head cook, a woman named Celia Washington. Her weapon of choice wasn't steel or lead. It was dinner, and on that night, every course she served carried a verdict, one that would make the devil himself stop and listen. Before we begin, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Let me know down in the comments. And if you love uncovering dark, forgotten stories like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more history waiting to be unearthed. It was the spring of 1849. Mississippi was blooming again after a long, cold winter. Cotton fields spread out like blankets of white sugar, and the air hung thick with the perfume of magnolia trees. From a distance, it looked like paradise. But beneath that beauty was a world built on cruelty. A system where one race held the whip and the other bore the scars. Slavery wasn't just legal here. It was the heartbeat of the South, the foundation that every brick of wealth rested upon. Celia Washington worked as the head cook at Riverside Plantation, a woman known for her gentle heart and steady hands. She was the kind of person who hummed church hymns while stirring her pots, who shared scraps of bread with hungry children, who loved her 3 little ones, Thomas, Mary, and David, with every ounce of her soul. But all of that changed one night. The master's family accused her children of wasting food, a spilled pot of milk on the kitchen floor. For that crime they were punished. By morning, all three were dead. That night broke something deep inside Celia, something that could never be mended. She stopped humming. She stopped smiling. The warmth that once lived in her eyes turned to ash, and in the silence of her grief, a seed of vengeance began to grow. Months later, behind the quiet of her kitchen walls, Celia began to plan, not in rage, but in precision, a plan that would one day make her name echo across Mississippi, whispered in fear by masters, and in reverence by those who had once been enslaved. Celia began writing again, but these were no longer recipes tucked between flour-stained pages. Her handwriting, once used to mark measurements and oven times, now carried thoughts about justice, patience, and the brittle hush of silence after a loss. Night after night, she sat by candlelight and filled the little book Mama Ruth had given her with lines that read less like instructions and more like a vow. One night she wrote in letters pressed as if carved into the page, "They think we don't see, don't remember, don't feel, but we are the living memory of all their sins. And memory, when it finally speaks, has a voice that echoes through centuries." Those words shifted something in the way she moved through the world, not with rage that burned and consumed, but with a cold, precise calm that made every action feel inevitable. Samuel noticed the change first in small things, the way she wrapped her hands around a bowl, as if feeling its weight in more than one way, the way she lingered a fraction longer at the window after dusk. Then he found, tucked beneath a stack of clean linens, a note signed differently, Celia Washington. When he asked why she'd chosen the name, she only answered softly, as though telling him a secret she would carry alone. "Because I am free to choose my own name and my own destiny." Samuel didn't ask for more. He saw grief, yes, but also a determination that had steadied her like iron. Behind the closed doors of the kitchen, Celia studied. Not the kind of learning that shouted itself in rooms and halls, but the quiet apprenticeship of those who have been taught in whispers. What Mama Ruth had once called the language of the earth. She returned to the old lessons, which roots stirred the stomach into revolt, which dried petals dulled the senses, which bitter seeds could slow a man's step until he could not stand. She read the margins of recipe books left open in the main house, watched how different foods paired with conversation and mood, and practiced tiny, controlled experiments on her own body, tasting, waiting, noting the hours and the subtle curves of effect, always careful to keep names vague and knowledge contained. Each spice jar, each labeled tin in the pantry, became more than seasoning. It became a letter in a sentence she was composing. The onion that made one man nostalgic, the pepper that flushed the cheek of another, the sweet syrup that cloaked an aftertaste of iron. All of it was rearranged in her mind into a pattern that would form a single night's verdict. She never sought to wield blind cruelty. Her planning was surgical, a measure here to wake a memory, a dash there to ensure an ending that matched a life's cruelty. In the hush before dawn, she folded the little notebook closed, laid it where only she would find it, and for the first time since the fire, allowed herself to imagine a future that was not defined by what had been taken, but by what she would return to the world. January 27th, 1849, the wedding day of Pearl Riverside, the only daughter of the plantation master. The winter air was crisp, the sky a dull porcelain blue, and frost clung to the corners of every window. From a distance, Riverside looked like a painting of wealth and order. White columns, bright ribbons, and wagons arriving one after another, each carrying laughter, silk gowns, and men in fine coats. To everyone else, it was a celebration. To Celia, it was Judgment Day. She awoke at 3 in the morning, her heartbeat steady, her mind already clear. In the kitchen, fires were lit and 3 great ovens roared to life. The scent of bread and smoke mingled as steam rolled across the windows. Her assistants, unaware of the storm beneath her calm, moved with a practiced rhythm, chopping, stirring, passing trays, each step like a note in a silent symphony. Celia oversaw everything. No dish left the counter without her eyes tracing it. No sauce stirred without her tasting it first. She worked like a conductor leading an orchestra, but her instruments were ladles, knives, and spoons. Every dish had a purpose. Every guest, a fate sealed in flavor. The oyster appetizers shimmered under candlelight, delicate and briny. The turtle soup simmered thick and dark, filling the air with a comforting aroma. The roasted pork glistened under a honey glaze, the perfect disguise for what it carried. Colonel Thompson, the man who once laughed while ordering a boy whipped until he could no longer stand. It was served pork glazed with a blend that would slowly still his breath, one shallow inhale at a time. His wife, Matilda, famous for her discipline, had demanded the best cut of lamb. Celia prepared it tender, rich, and coated in a subtle glaze that would send her mind into chaos, a poison that twisted memory into nightmare, forcing her to see the faces of those she had destroyed. Their sons, proud and cruel in their father's image, received plates that looked identical to the others. Only Celia knew that each was dosed carefully, measured by weight and habit, designed to lock their limbs and silence their laughter before the night's end. And then there was Addison Riverside, the master, the man whose decisions had burned down her world. For him, Celia saved the most intricate creation of her life, roasted duck, brushed with a glaze she had spent months perfecting. A deadly trinity of poisons, each one crueler than the last. It would not kill quickly. No, Addison would feel every moment of his body's betrayal, his heart slowing, his breath tightening, his mind trapped in awareness until the final second. Yet even in vengeance, Celia drew a line between guilt and innocence. The children of the guests, laughing and running through the halls, were served warm porridge and milk, a comforting meal laced only with harmless herbs that would send them into a deep, dreamless sleep long before the chaos began. She would not stain her justice with the blood of the blameless. By evening, the grand hall shone like a beacon. Candles flickered along every table, crystal glasses sparkled beneath chandeliers, and violins sang softly in the corner. Laughter rippled through the air, the kind of laughter that believed itself untouchable. Celia stood quietly in the doorway, her apron spotless, her eyes steady. And then came the toasts, silver goblets raised high, voices slurred with wine and pride. "To the bride and groom," someone called. "To the south," shouted another. The guests drank, smiling, never knowing that their final taste of life had just passed their lips. It began just as the clock struck 9. The violins were still playing, the candles still burning steady, but the laughter had started to fade. Colonel Thompson, standing tall and red-faced, was in the middle of another long-winded toast about honor and legacy when his voice broke mid-sentence. A sharp breath, a trembling hand to his stomach, and then his glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. At first, people laughed, thinking he'd had too much wine, but the laughter died quickly. His knees buckled, his lips turned pale, and then the sound came, a choking gasp that cut through the music like a blade. Matilda Thompson let out a strangled cry, clutching her throat as her eyes went wide, the whites glowing against the candlelight. She staggered backward, knocking over her chair, gasping as though the air itself had turned to fire. A murmur spread across the table. Another guest coughed, then another. Soon, spoons were clattering against porcelain, goblets spilled crimson wine across white linen, and the soft sound of music turned into screams. The grand hall, once radiant and alive, dissolved into chaos. Servants rushed forward but froze in confusion as guests began convulsing, trembling, collapsing one after another. The chandeliers trembled as bodies fell, silver trays crashed to the ground, and the scent of roasted meat mixed with something darker, the acrid tang of fear. Someone tried to pray. Another shouted orders that no one could follow. Addison Riverside, the master of the house, sat still at the head of the table, his face flushed with confusion. He tried to stand, gripping the edge of the table for balance, but his legs refused him. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. A hand clutched at his chest. Then his eyes lifted toward the kitchen doorway. And there she was, Celia Washington. Her apron was immaculate, her expression calm, not proud, not cruel, simply resolved. The flames from the dining candles flickered across her face as she watched him. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The screams, the clatter, the chaos. Addison's gaze locked with hers, and in that silence, understanding dawned. He knew. The man who had owned her life, who had destroyed her children, finally saw her not as a servant, not as property, but as judgment itself. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His eyes widened, glassy and terrified, as his body began to betray him. Celia did not move toward him. She did not speak. She simply reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small folded piece of paper, and placed it gently on the nearest table. Then, without another glance, she turned and walked down the hall, her footsteps soft against the wooden floor, fading into the night. When rescuers arrived the next morning, the house was silent. The fire in the hearth had burned out, the air thick with the stench of spoiled food and spilled wine. 17 bodies lay scattered across the dining room, their faces twisted in agony, frozen in the final moments of realization. The once celebratory banners now hung limp, stained, and torn. On the table, amid the overturned plates and broken glass, they found a single piece of paper, edges singed from a candle's flame. Written in a steady, deliberate hand, the note read, "For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served." Celia Washington, that was all. No plea, no apology, no escape plan. Just a mother's verdict, written plain and final. And though the plantation would burn before the week was done, no one ever saw Celia again. Some said she vanished into the swamps. Others whispered that she was seen years later, working under a new name up north. But those who knew her story believed something else, that Celia Washington didn't run. She simply walked into history, leaving her justice written in blood and silence. The news spread faster than any fire the Mississippi winds had ever carried. Within days, every paper from Natchez to New Orleans screamed the same headline in thick black letters, "The Riverside Wedding Massacre." To some, it was a tragedy, a cruel and senseless act. But to many in silence, especially among the enslaved, it was something else entirely. It was proof that justice, though slow and unseen, could still find its way through the cracks of cruelty. The South had never witnessed anything like it. 17 of its most powerful names gone in a single night. No rebellion, no uprising, no gunfire. Just a meal and a woman who refused to remain silent. Panic spread through the plantations like a fever. Kitchens, once filled with laughter and music, turned quiet. Masters began locking their pantries, dismissing cooks who had served them faithfully for decades. Guards were stationed at every kitchen door. Food was tasted before being served, and water was poured only after being tested. The same hands that once fed them now terrified them. For the first time, the men who held the whips felt what fear truly tasted like. It wasn't the fear of rebellion or loss of wealth. It was the realization that the people they called property had minds that remembered, hearts that planned, and souls that refused to die quietly. Celia Washington had shattered an illusion that had lasted for centuries, the illusion of submission. Across the South, whispers spread in the quarters. Mothers hummed new lullabies to their children, songs about a woman who served justice on a silver tray. Elders told her story in low voices by the fire, passing her name from mouth to mouth like a secret prayer. Celia had become more than a woman. She was a symbol. A ghost that haunted the nightmares of slaveholders and lived as hope in the hearts of the enslaved. Authorities offered a $500 reward for her capture, dead or alive. Posters went up in towns, along crossroads, even at church doors. Men rode with dogs through the swamps, lanterns glowing like tiny, angry stars in the dark. But Celia was gone, Some said she vanished into the thick marshlands, moving only at night, following hidden trails carved long ago by those who had escaped before her. Others claimed she was helped by the Underground Railroad, passing from safe house to safe house under new names. Her small notebook always hidden close to her chest. There were rumors she died in the woods, her body never found. But there were other stories too, the kind told in hushed voices that carried a strange comfort. They said that years later, in a small town in Pennsylvania, a woman with kind eyes and a southern drawl opened a bakery. She wore a locket around her neck with 3 tiny initials carved inside, T, M, and D. No one knew for certain, but what they did know was this. After that winter night, nothing was the same. The masters had lost their peace, and the enslaved had gained something priceless, the knowledge that even one voice, one act, could shake an empire. Celia Washington's name was never written in history books. Her grave, if it exists, has no marker, but her story lived on, not in ink, but in whispers, in songs, and in the quiet defiance of every soul who refused to kneel again. Years later, whispers of Celia Washington began drifting across states like smoke no one could quite catch. Some said she was seen in Tennessee, working quietly on a small farm under a false name. Others swore she'd made it to Ohio, living among free blacks, tending a small garden behind her home. And there were those who believed she'd gone even further, to Canada, where the snow would finally erase her footprints for good. But no one ever found her. No body, no confession, no closure. Just a trail of rumors. And perhaps that's exactly how she wanted it. In the slave quarters of the South, her name took on a life of its own. Children grew up hearing it whispered in the dark, like a bedtime story for the brave. Mothers would lower their voices and say, "Remember Celia Washington. She didn't wait for freedom. She made it." To the masters, her name brought a chill down the spine. Every time a spoon clinked against a bowl, they remembered her. Every meal carried the taste of fear. They couldn't forget her, because she had proven the one thing they refused to believe, that the enslaved had power far greater than chains could contain. But to the enslaved, she wasn't a monster. She was a message, a reminder that even those the world forgets still carry memory. That even those who are beaten into silence still remember the sound of justice. Celia Washington wasn't just a cook who killed her oppressors. She was a symbol of something far deeper. The moment history itself turned its gaze back at the powerful and whispered, "You are not untouchable." She wasn't the beginning of rebellion. She wasn't the end of it either. She was the spark, proof that even the powerless can rise when pushed too far, and maybe somewhere, in the quiet hum of the Mississippi night, when the wind passes through the empty fields, you can still hear her voice, steady, calm, unbroken, saying, "For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served." Celia Washington's story forces us to ask difficult questions. Was it justice or revenge? Was she a murderer or a messenger? Maybe she was both. Celia didn't act out of madness. She acted with intention. Every step, every ingredient, every decision came from years of pain and silence finally finding a voice. And in that moment, her justice wasn't blind. It was human, because she didn't strike at random. She spared the innocent. She punished only those who thrived on cruelty, and maybe that's what makes her story so haunting, not the death she caused, but the truth she revealed, that sometimes silence can be more violent than vengeance. Soft music fades in, somber, reflective tone. Celia didn't just poison her oppressors. She poisoned the system that fed on silence, the illusion that the enslaved had no power, no choice, no voice. Even now on cold Mississippi nights, locals say the wind carries her name, whispering through the old cotton fields. Justice may be served cold, but it is always served. Her story reminds us that justice isn't always clean. Sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's painful, but it's always necessary. If this story touched something inside you, share it. Because history doesn't forget, and neither did Celia Washington. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Did Celia find true freedom in the end? Or was her justice too heavy a price for her soul? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And before you go, tell me, where are you watching from? I love seeing how far these forgotten stories travel, and if you believe in uncovering voices that history tried to bury. Don't forget to subscribe, because more hidden truths like this one are coming soon.